Welcome to the RWG January 2025 webinar. You're in for a treat today. Well, I'd like to welcome Dr. Beth Wilson. She's going to be presenting today on the Guide to Security Needs and Requirements. Dr. Wilson earned her PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Rhode Island. She is retired from Raytheon, where she worked for 33 years as a design engineer, a program manager, a research scientist, functional manager, and test director on sonar, satellite, and radar programs. Dr. Wilson is currently an adjunct professor at Worcester Polytech Institute in their Masters of Science and System Engineering program, teaching online classes and certainly not to interfere with her hobbies of golf and skiing. She is an INCOSE ESEP, also an INCOSE Certification Advisory Group member. She's a co-chair to the INCOSE System Security Working Group and an active member of the System of Systems Agile Working Group and the Requirements Working Group. So with that, we welcome Dr. Wilson, and I hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Today we're going to cover this new Guide to Security Needs and Requirements. This is a new addition to the Requirements Working Group products family. While the Needs and Requirements Manual and the Guide to Needs and Requirements, the Guide to Verification and Validation, and the Guide to Writing Requirements was being updated, we were looking at how these products would resonate with system security engineers, and the result is the Guide to Security Needs and Requirements. And I'll talk a little bit about how we formatted the guide in hopes that other domains could use the same structure for their domain-specific guides. We launched this as a security focus for the needs, requirements, verification, and validation concepts overview. As a member of the Requirements Working Group, I really resonated with this approach. I love the idea of transforming the stakeholder real-world expectations into needs and then translating the needs into system-level requirements. The design input requirements I think of as the black box system requirements, and then that transformation through architecture development and design definition into the subsystem specifications, the subsystem requirements, the requirements in the white box format, and then making sure that we are thinking about the transformation to implementation as in the operational environment and how that system would be sustained in the operational environment. And my test director background loved seeing the arrows on the bottom that reflected verification to the requirements and the arrows on the top reflecting validation to the needs. And so I really like this structure and wanted to find out how we could make this work for what we were trying to accomplish in the System Security Working Group. Because in that working group, we have an initiative related to the future of systems engineering, and the focus is on these foundation concepts that you see here. As we look at the NRVV concepts, we see many of these initiatives that we were working on in System Security Fuse. And one of the primary ones was this idea of security as a functional requirement, trying to move away from security as non-functional requirements, and that we only think about the techniques and the tactics, to actually bring it up to think about the strategy. We also were focused on the one in the middle, the security proficiency and the system engineering team, wanting to make it so that there's more collaboration and interaction between the systems engineering team and the system security engineering teams, and that we're not having requirements punted to specialty engineers or the security experts and saying, you take care of it. We want this to be a collaborative effort to design a system that is secure. The other things that we were focusing on, the capability-based engineering, the stakeholder alignment, the loss-driven engineering, that drew us into this approach for security needs and requirements that's needs-oriented, loss-driven, and capability-based. So we saw some synergy. In October 2022, we had a kickoff for a joint project. That kickoff focused on what were the things we don't want to have happen because it's what we do right now and it's not working. And we called these the anti-patterns for security. How could we transform those into some desired pattern that through the project we came to have be the needs-oriented, loss-driven, capability-based analysis? That's what we want. Through the 2 years that we were working this project, we also were experimenting with guides, thinking that this was the first domain-specific guide. We wanted it to be something that other areas could use to format. So what we did is, I'm also a member of the System of Systems Working Group. So we were working these two in parallel. And so we went through 3 different approaches, landing on the third one that became the result of the publication last August. So I'll also describe those formats and how we came to what we published last August. So let's start first with the anti-patterns. So one of the anti-patterns we identified, we called it the we use a security expert. Everyone agrees that the need is we want a secure system, but we end up with requirements that are non-functional requirements that are created by the requirements team and reviewed by security, or they might even be created by the person brought in for security. But the resulting system, when we put it into the intended environment, is not secure. And the anti-pattern here is this thought that one security SME could cover all of the system security disciplines. So you can have an information assurance expert that has a lot of IT credentials, but just because they have a lot of initials after their name doesn't mean that they understand everything about system security. And we shouldn't be having them look at anti-tamper. And if you have a software assurance expert, you don't want them reviewing a supply chain statement of work. So the idea that there's software assurance, supply chain, information assurance, anti-tamper, OPSEC, you have hardware integrity. There are many aspects to system security, and pulling in one expert and saying, can you take a look at these? That doesn't do the trick. And the mental model we're fighting here is we had the security expert look at it, so we're all set. Now, the second anti-pattern was, okay, we agreed to have multiple security experts that think about different aspects of system security, but they do a security review after the design is complete. So we still have the need that we want a secure system. And someone has written requirements that basically say it shall be secure. But the collaboration is having the system security practitioner be on a review team after the design is so far along that the design team is pretty sentimental about it and they're not willing to change it. And quite frankly, if the team is not engaged in the architecture, it's very difficult for the security review, the security practitioners, to then identify that you need to segment and separate networks or something like that after the architecture is complete, because then all the subsystem specs have been defined. They've been written based on that architecture, and it feels like it's too late to address what has been identified as vulnerabilities. So the review is not for input. It's not even for feedback. It's just for concurrence. So the anti-pattern here is that you allow system security practitioners to review the design, but only after it's complete. And the mental model that we're struggling with here is, wow, they identify some scary scenarios, but you know what? It's too late to change anything. And oh, by the way, when we asked them if we could make it completely secure, they said no. So it doesn't matter anyways. We don't have to do anything. We can't do it all, so we might as well not do anything. The big anti-pattern that the System Security Working Group struggles with is this idea of security controls. So we do understand the need that we want a secure system, but it's so tempting to go to the NIST SP 800-53 controls and call them requirements. And then verification becomes this compliance model of this checklist of controls that we go through. Now, I'm not disparaging controls. We need them. But the anti-pattern we see here is that you open up the controls closet, you pull everything out, and the resulting system is not secure. The mental model we struggle with is if we want to get the security certification, we need to make sure we include all the controls. If you're not familiar with the 800-53 controls, it is an excellent ontology and a way to organize techniques that we use to satisfy tactics. For example, you may think about access control, and people will be talking past each other as they talk about it. And the 853 specifies that the AC3, for example, is access enforcement. who do you allow to get into the network? And AC5 is a separation of duties, and AC6 is about least privilege. So you end up with a very precise way to talk about different techniques that we can use. So controls end up being this collection of techniques to implement security tactics. The problem is, and what this anti-pattern is getting at, is that you're implementing these tactics without a strategy. I looked up the quote from Sun Tzu from The Art of War, and it says, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. And it also says that tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So one of the issues with using security controls as requirements without doing the necessary needs assessment to establish a strategy is that you end up with tactics without strategy. And you end up with noise before defeat because the operational system is not secure. And then the last anti-pattern I wanted to share was the non-functional requirement. The idea that we still have this need, we want a secure system, but now we write requirements as non-functional requirements, and we say, okay, we shall do X, Y, Z securely. We shall store data securely. Well, that doesn't really tell the design team how to do this. And so they end up just, going back to that controls closet and pulling some things out as basic security measures. And then the verification is confirming that the basic security measure is in place, not necessarily that it was effective. The graphic I chose to go with this is one where, if you can't see it clearly, it's a road and there's a gate that's supposed to stop people from proceeding into the facility. And you just see all these tire tracks driving around the gate. So, if you put some basic security measures in place, the adversary just goes around them. So the anti-pattern here is treating security as a non-functional requirement. And the mental model is if we just add a firewall, require some passwords, maybe encrypt some data that seems kind of scary, we'll be all set. So the purpose of exploring the anti-patterns was to develop the desired pattern. If we were able to articulate what we didn't want, how do we describe what we do want? So what we're doing here is using loss-driven analysis to define the needs. And in the language of system security, these needs become protection needs. And then the requirements are where we have security described as a functional requirement. And these are capabilities that we've defined to mitigate the loss scenarios from our needs assessment. And then the design becomes identifying the security gaps in the mission threads, and verification is confirming the capabilities to mitigate the loss scenarios. And then now when the operational system is deployed, we have mission success. So the mental model here is needs-oriented, loss-driven, capability-based analysis. And the mental model is systems engineers working with system security practitioners. Right, so we have needs analysis focused on the loss scenario, and we have requirements analysis focused on the capabilities to mitigate the loss scenarios. Now we have the strategy before the tactics. Let me get into some of our guide experiments that we tried. So the first thing we did was we tried to develop a separate and standalone guide. And for the security experiment, we were mapping NIST 800-160, which describes all the process activities related to security. And we were going to map them to the requirements working group products. And then in the case of system of systems, we would map the ISO 21840 standard, talks about the system of systems activities aligned with the 15288 technical processes, and map that to requirements working group products. As we started to work on it, we said, oh, this is not going to work. Because if we take all of the requirements working group products, so we get the needs and requirements manual, the guide to needs and requirements, the guide to writing requirements, the guide to verification validation, and then on top of that, we put NIST SP 800-160. Put those two together, you've got something that is hundreds of pages. And that's why I have this boat anchor. The only thing it would be worthwhile having it for is to anchor a boat, because it would just be too big to use. It would run hundreds of pages and it would duplicate these products. The other thing we saw was, well, wait a minute, now we're only targeting the system security practitioners. So if we went this approach, the systems engineers would read the requirements working group guides, and then the system security engineers would read the system security working group guides. And we were losing that desire to have collaboration so that we would be designing a secure system. So we decided to go to a Rosetta Stone translation. The Rosetta Stone was a later term. Originally, I had called it a decoder ring, but then I was cautioned that that was an American term and a generational American term because it was something that I found in my cereal box as a kid, but systems engineers in working now don't necessarily understand what that is. So we said, okay, we'll call it a Rosetta Stone. It's a way to translate the needs and requirements verification validation terms and help the system security engineers see themselves in the guides, help the system of systems engineers see themselves in the guides. And so we went through every term and translated it. So, for example, when we look at the need statement that is on the NRVV concept diagram, system security looks at that and says, oh, I know what you mean. That's a protection need. And the system of systems engineer looks at that and says, oh, I know what you mean. That's a capability objective. So we ended up with this translation of the terms to the domain. Well, that was definitely going to be shorter. So, we didn't have a boat anchor anymore, but we still targeted separate audiences. So the systems engineer would read the requirements working group guides, and the system security engineer would need to read those guides with the translator open. It would be a lot of work to translate the terms and understand what to do, but it was also going to lead to more confusion because if we did start to get the collaboration we wanted between the systems engineer and the system security engineer, they would be using different terms for the same thing. And so they'd be talking past each other all the time, and it would not be effective. So what we landed on was this approach to explain the domain specific focus of the NRVV terms. And so instead of trying to cast it separately, and what you see on the left is this is what the term means. This is what the requirements working group products describe a need statement as. This is what it means. And then what the system security engineer is saying is, defining what a protection need is, and then saying from a security perspective, when we solicit needs for security capabilities, this is how we need to do this. And so this is where we introduce the concept of loss-driven lifecycle concepts and doing needs analysis from the perspective of asking a stakeholder, what is it that represents an unacceptable loss to you? And so doing that loss-driven analysis. This is just an example. So for each of the terms, we put the term there, and then we elaborate on the security focus board. So now we end up with a 26-page document, and you see the table of contents on the right, and it targets both the systems engineer and the system security engineer practitioners. So both parties can be using this to define security needs and security requirements. This is what we published last August, and let me give you a quick preview of what is in there. So the first section is the introduction and basically describing that it's intended for the system security practitioner so that they can use the guide to better understand the requirements working group products and adapt their guidance on security needs and requirements. And it's also targeting the system engineering practitioner who's working with the system security engineer that they can use the guide to better define security needs and requirements. So we have a section that talks about the security view of NRVV. And so we start out by identifying the shortfalls of defining security requirements as non-functional requirements and describe the needs-oriented, loss-driven, capability-based approach. And we have one example that we put just to make it a little clearer. So we show as an example, you have a non-functional requirement the system shall store data securely. And what we defined is, okay, that's a security need that we can describe as a protection need. And so we recast that as there's a need for the system of interest to protect personally identifiable information data. That was just the example we were using here. And so then the example resulting need after the needs definition gets transformed into a strategy that the stakeholders need the system of interest to allow only authorized users access to personally identifiable information data. As we transform needs into requirements, we end up with two resulting design input requirements. One is that the system shall encrypt PII data stored within the SOI, and the other one is that the system shall restrict access to PII data to authorized users only. So we've shown an example of how we envision the needs-oriented, loss-driven capability approach. When we get to the lifecycle concepts and needs analysis, we relate the need statements to protection needs. We define security needs by developing loss scenarios, assurance cases, and misuse cases. So we're asking the stakeholders, what losses can you tolerate and still complete the mission? And what adversaries exist in the operational environment? So we develop protection needs for the system. So in this section, we define security focus for the NRVV terms, lifecycle concepts and needs analysis, the need statements, the integrated set of needs, the need statement verification, and the need statement validation. And what we proposed in this section is a template to use for these security needs. That you have the system of interest or stakeholders, users, whoever it is, needs, and then you define the protection need to ensure, and you define the security objective in the event of, and then you define the potential loss scenario. So we're relating the protection need to the loss scenario that we are trying to prevent. When we get to the needs and requirements transformation, now we're translating protection needs into system capabilities that are provided by the system to prevent the loss scenarios. So we define security capabilities as functional requirements. In this section, we define security focus for the NRVV terms of design input requirements definition, requirement statement verification, and requirement statement validation. And in the requirements statement verification, we look to the requirements working group guide to writing requirements to define if it has the attributes of a good requirement. In the requirement statement validation, we're looking to ensure that tactics support security strategies and planned techniques will implement those tactics. Let me just take a minute to explain that we talk about needs as the loss-driven problem to solve. We talk about strategy as the what are the essential functions that must be secured, and what represents an acceptable loss. So the strategy are desired outcomes that we express as capabilities. And then tactics are the how, the things we do as a means to achieve a strategy. And techniques are also how, but these are the means to achieve the tactics. As an example, I may have a strategy, the strategy for the example I posed earlier, to only allow authorized users to access PII. And then I develop tactics to encrypt the PII data and to restrict access. And then I have techniques to implement these tactics. So taking the restricted access example, I have techniques related to role-based access control, least privilege, user authentication, things that I'm going to be implementing in the lower level. So an oversimplified way of thinking of this is that the needs are protection needs. The strategies are the refined needs that we transform into requirements. The tactics are the requirements that we define as design input requirements at the black box level. And then the techniques are the requirements that we define at the subsystem level, the design output specifications at the white box level that are means to achieve the tactics. The tactics are means to achieve the strategy, and the strategy is a means to achieve the needs. Okay. And then we go to requirements analysis. This is where we transform the black box, the opaque box, into a white box, a transparent box, including architecture definition. And this is where we transition from the what to protect to the how to protect it. And this is where we're making the transition from the tactics to the techniques. So we define the security focus for the NRVV terms, architecture and design definition, and design output specification. I personally have a real bias toward making sure that security is involved in the architecture definition, because this is where, when we talk about designing in our security, this is where we do it, is in the architecture. You can't restructure the networks later. You can't do a defense in depth as a strategy by looking at the design output specifications. You need to do that as part of the architecture. So the architecture development is an important insertion point for the system security engineering. And what we talk about is that there are passive security functions that do not exhibit behavior. These are represented as structure constructs. An example is like network segmentation. And then we have active security functions. These exhibit behavior and they're represented by functional constructs. So an example of that would be something like user authentication. And then we move into the design and system verification and validation, where we talk about requirements verification and we talk about needs validation. So we define the security focus for the NRBV terms of design verification, design validation, production verification, system verification, and system validation. And this is where we ensure that the system test scenarios successfully accomplish loss scenarios. So we need to have test procedures that allow us to demonstrate that the security tactics and the security techniques have satisfied the security strategy, and we have accomplished the capabilities that we defined in the requirement. So we need to ensure that the security tactics satisfy the security strategies. And then we have post-development verification and validation. This is where we're looking to achieve sustainable security so that we can enable continuous secure operation. This is where we confirm that the loss-driven scenarios are still relevant, and we confirm that the security strategy is sustainable. So the goal here is to use loss-driven capability-based analysis to intentionally design systems that achieve sustainable security. Okay, so this is my last slide. By way of summary, the Guide to Security Needs and Requirements is the result of a 2-year collaboration effort between the Requirements Working Group and the System Security Working Group. We advocate that we perform needs-oriented, loss-driven capability analysis across the needs, requirements, verification, validation, concept activities. We advocate that we define security as a functional requirement. And we believe that the format we're using is the basis for other domain-specific guides. And we're really looking for this guide to promote collaborative efforts of systems engineering and system security engineering to design a system that can protect from, react to, and recover from adversity to achieve and sustain mission success. All right, so I have been ignoring the chat window. I'll now pull that over and take a look at it. Oh yeah, the mapping for medical device guide. I'm curious, Keith, if you think that this third format would be helpful.
We're basically stolen your document and turned it into a Word document, and we're using that as a basis for what we're doing. So yes.
Because what we're thinking of is, for other guides, what we'd like to do is to use the same format. And so I'm looking at the example I was showing. So what I want to do for system to systems and what I would advocate that you do for medical devices is that the NRBB terms stay the same, and then you just change the focus. And where this is important is when you send it to reviewers, because you don't want your medical device practitioners trying to edit the NRBB term. You only want them to edit the focus.
Yes.
Anything that we could come up with where we lock in the NRBV, I want to do this more like a product line approach, where we vary the focus. All right, so Catherine has a question here about security strategies. Are these formalized and documented somewhere? In a sense, and the reason I'm reluctant to say they're formalized and documented somewhere is because that goes to the controls anti-pattern, because they're defined in the controls, but the application of security tactics and strategies is part of the analysis. As an example, I'm thinking of things like I may want to make sure that my data is protected. So my tactic is going to be to segregate the network so that data, I can encrypt it in a way that's different than other parts of the network. But then I'm also going to require that somebody who has access to that particular network that they have to be authenticated to make sure that they should be there. Okay, so were SSEs involved in the development of the guide? Definitely. There's a whole gang of us. There were two of us that agreed to be the authors, and then the rest were expert reviewers and gave us very good and actionable feedback that we incorporated in there.
Hey, Beth, a point that you've talked about before, but not completely in this presentation because the focus is on needs and requirements, and they're a common thread throughout the life cycle. But security has a role in architecture, design, and operations in its own right. So what makes an architecture more secure? What kind of things should the design team think about when they're doing design from a security standpoint? And that chart you showed in the bottom were a bunch of what we call design controls, comes to the medical device world, but it's really requirements on the organization that's doing the activities. And so what design controls should the architects and designers and operators, in addition to just what was defined as needs and requirements for the system as a whole?
So you're talking about what would we consider as these organizational architecture requirements?
Yes. It's probably addressed in the standards. I'm not sure. Yeah, because you do go through the 15288 life cycles in there, right?
There's 800, 160 to talk about what needs to be done in each of the areas. So what we're doing in the architecture is the system security practitioner is able to use the loss scenarios with the architecture to identify vulnerabilities. And that's where we say, look, if we had this loss scenario, the adversary would be able to get to this part of the network and they would be able to make it so that you can't complete this particular capability or you can't execute this part of the mission. And so in identifying those vulnerabilities, then they can go back to the security strategies and tactics and say, well, if we have some network segregation, if we pull that apart, if an adversary gets into that part, then they can't get to this other part. And we can propose changes to the architecture that would implement those tactics.
So requirement-wise, needs and requirements that we were talking about was more on the system being built, but I think equally important are the design controls in these orange boxes that each organization talks about safety, security, resilience, approaches to architecting and approaches to design.
Right. I agree. So I'm looking at, and then the next one, does the guide include any discussion on certifications or similar qualifications that are more control-based or how to balance certs versus desired outcomes? No, we don't get into that at all. There's a different project in the System Security Working Group looking at some kind of credential that demonstrates awareness of system security the way we're talking about here.
My question, maybe it didn't come across entirely, was when we have company certifications or vendor requirements for like a contractual sort of thing in the US DoD, it's what CMMC, CUI stuff, and the TISAX, I think, is over in Europe for automotive suppliers. And it's a big laundry list of, hey, do these security control things for your IT systems and more, physical and information. And there's usually some cultural habits or however much you want to think about that need to be balanced, and wasn't sure if you found this approach to be more helpful or less helpful to get past or through that sort of clutter.
What you're describing is we used a security expert anti-pattern.
That's correct.
Where, that you find somebody that has a lot of initials after their name, so they must be an expert, but they only know how to put a firewall on an IT system. They don't know how to architect a system to remove the vulnerabilities under attack or to be able to recover once attacked.
Yeah, to be able to explain the why. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, this is GtWR. If I might tack on to that, I've got a similar situation, and I think one of the opportunities I have, a lot of these cybersecurity requirements that are flowing to us now through the DoD are relatively recent, and I think 2017 is when they really started getting serious about thinking about the requirements in that domain. And I'm not sure we don't still have an opportunity to shape the requirements. I mean, it's true that we've got a contractual conveyance that says, hey, establish all these controls. I guess in the short term, I'm thinking build that into the requirement set along with your functional, but keep those segregated or traceable such that you can go present functional-based requirements you've developed as a potential alternative to some of those and potentially negotiate some of those controls out.
My concern about that is I remember our short-lived and misguided euphoria when the RMF came out, when the risk management framework came out, because we thought, oh, good, we'll finally get people to say, stop thinking that they have to use every control, and now we'll do this risk-based assessment and determine which controls make sense. And the opposite happened. Now we had to have all the controls, and look, we got all these new controls, and it just became more is better. So it became all about the quantity over the quality. And I think what I would like to see is that we think about the controls as a language and not a set of requirements. The controls are the way we describe these tactics, and the requirements define how we implement these tactics in the system. And if we can think of the controls as a dictionary and not a how-to guide, we might be able to make some progress.
That makes a lot of sense. One other follow-up on my earlier comment on the I don't know if there's a professional organization, kind of maybe similar to INCOSE for system security engineers, but I would like to, in fact, I almost invited my lead system security engineer to view this presentation with me today, but I'd like to go back in and engage him. Is there some other venue that's possible? Maybe this presentation is the best way to do that.
You mean other than the System Security Working Group?
He's not participating in that. So yeah, I guess, is there an outreach to folks to become members of that?
If you're an INCOSE member, you just select that working group. It's a very active working group, and I will caution that we have a lot of members. Rick will refer to the large majority as lurkers, and then we have a few workers. I say we have a big fan club that watches the workers. But it is a place to see what we're doing and opportunities to participate on some of the projects.
And Dave, we also have it in INCOSE RWG YouTube channel, and the presentation will be put on that. And one reason we do that is so we can entice non-INCOSE members saying, here's work that INCOSE is doing. You want to get more involved, you should join INCOSE. And so that's kind of a public outreach forum that we have.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I want to do here. I'm pretty sure this individual is not participating or maybe not even aware, so I will reach out and try to bring him into the practice. Thank you.
One thing I want to point out to everyone, concurrently with producing this guide to security needs and requirements, we were also updating the Needs and Requirements Manual to version 2, which is now published by Wiley. Because we were doing them both at the same time, the Needs and Requirements Manual reflects the basic concepts that Beth talked about. It talks about misuse cases. It talks about loss scenarios. It talks about security as a functional requirement, the capabilities. So there's a lot of consistency between the two.
So I'm looking at the chat. Okay, so John asked, how do you differentiate between threat-based and loss-driven approaches? That's a good question, because the threat-based approach is what drives us to tactics. And what we're looking for in the loss-driven approach is to start with the strategy and then move to the tactics, when it's just a different way of doing it, hoping that we now will achieve the strategy. The threat-based approach is really focused on the tactics that will address that threat. And instead, we're trying to say, what are the strategies that will protect the system from the losses? How do we mitigate the loss scenario?
First, let me say, Beth, this is a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate it, and I can see why you must be a valued professor. Highly understandable. But where I'm going to go is, I was in a workshop led by Michael McEvely and Mark Winstead in support of ASD R&E for DoD a few years ago. That's where they started investigating loss-driven approaches. One of the things that drove me a little bit crazy was we talk about loss-driven, but so often we end up in a threat-driven construct. By that, I mean, like MITRE ATT&CK, we look at all the potential threats and what they might be able to do. And that becomes, in my mind, almost a fool's errand. You're never going to get to that complete view of it all. So if we start really embracing this notion of loss-driven, what that tells me is we're looking at something that says, okay, we've got a degradation from 0 to 1 of a capability. And that capability is for the system to perform as intended, or secondarily for the mission of the using entity to achieve its objectives. So if we look at loss, we're looking at a state change. The system state has changed. to me, that drives towards a second question, which you'll maybe come to later, is this, and you addressed it briefly, of adaptability. So where I'm going with all this is in terms of a loss-driven approach, and I love the way you're looking at loss as a loss primarily of needs and at a strategic level. What does the system really need to be able to do and to what degree? And getting away from the threat-based approach kind of obviates the need to do all that analysis. Not gets rid of it all, but it minimizes how much threat analysis you have to do because you're focusing on system state changes. And then you can engineer in adaptability functions, hopefully, that would allow you to realize in this type of a loss situation, the system can adapt or a process can be introduced to compensate for a system loss or many, many other things. The point I'm making is I love the way you're focused here, particularly with that stakeholder real world expectations, the need to translate what those expectations are into conceptual, then into needs and capabilities oriented analyses, and then ultimately to the tactical or the system level type implementation considerations.
Yeah, and I think it maps well to the NRVV concept. Remember, too, the reason we focus on the threat-based analysis, you look at the MITRE attack database, and we're kind of overloading the phrase tactics here, because what we're looking at is what is the motivation of the attacker, and then how are they going to implement the attack to satisfy that motivation. And so what's externally facing from the attacker that we see is the tactic that they're using. And so if we do a threat-based analysis and we address that particular attack, we're ignoring the bigger picture of, well, we might be able to architect the system so that we can protect against multiple threats and multiple attack vectors. Now we think about the strategy. How do I minimize the attack surface? How do I implement defense in depth? Because my strategy is I don't want one failure to me and I'm compromised. When I look at this particular graphic, I can see that as we move from the stakeholder real world expectations to the integrated set of needs, I'm going to be doing my loss-driven analysis, but I'm also asking the stakeholders, what are the adversaries that exist? So I know what the threat environment is, but at a higher level. And then as I move from integrated set of needs to the design input requirements, now I'm saying, okay, what are the capabilities I need to be able to mitigate those loss scenarios? And then as I transform the design input requirements into design output specifications, now I'm getting into the threat analysis, and I'm able to look at the tactics and the techniques that will address the strategy that I represented as capabilities.
Right. But what I'm saying, though, is there's a slight differentiation or the nuance involved in the focus on threat versus the focus on loss. In my mind, they're two fundamentally different games. Often when we talk about a threat, we're talking about its capability, its capacity, and its commitment. But we rarely think about the conditions and the context. When we're looking at it from a systems engineering perspective, either at a systems level or even more importantly at a systems level, where can graceful degradation be better understood in terms of the conditions in the environment and the context in which a loss might be encountered, regardless of how the threat might introduce it. So I guess I'm a little bit more squishy on how I would understand the catalytic effects of how the threat engages. I'm more interested in the implications for the system's function and mission support that compensating for loss might involve. Because often we think about it only in terms of a technological response. Like you said, we segment the network, we introduce this, we introduce that. But sometimes there's a non-technical means that might be used to achieve ends. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it does. And I don't know which presentation you sat in on, but it was one of his presentations that I pulled that Sun Tzu quote from. The idea of strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. So you can't just do your loss-driven scenarios and call it done. You need to have that capability-based analysis that's going to tell you what tactics you need. And then the tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. That's what we're claiming is happening when we do the threat-based analysis, either in isolation or do it first.
Well, thank you very much.
And John, you had also talked about adaptability, and I think adaptability becomes a strategy, and then we implement tactics to make that strategy work. Andrew said perhaps it's too early to ask such a question, but does this approach help a system with a specific encryption mechanism deal with being completely undone by someone, the powerful computer? Actually, what you're getting at, Andrew, is this idea of sustainable security. What I talked about in the very last section is the idea of making sure that the loss-driven scenarios remain relevant. And so the data we're trying to protect with that particular encryption mechanism, that's still relevant, but we also need to confirm that the security strategy is sustainable. And if we have an encryption mechanism that can be completely undone by somebody that has a new computer, that strategy is no longer sustainable, and we need to reevaluate that. And then Lou asked us a threat-based approach include both external threats and internal threats. It has to. One of the things that we get nervous, system security, we kind of cringe when people say, oh, cybersecurity. We're like, no, it's much more than that. And not every security threat is an attack from the outside. Although when somebody falls for phishing and they download the malware gives access to the attacker. Now the attacker is an insider. But insider threat is a valid threat that we need to protect the system against across the whole life cycle. We need to think about insider threats when we're designing the system, when we're developing it, when we're testing it, when we're putting all the pieces together, and when we're maintaining it in the field. Joseph Scott, I agree with John. He's more differentiating threat-based versus loss-based. And the capability analysis, the loss-driven analysis happens from the stakeholder real-world expectations transforming into the integrated set of needs. The capability analysis goes from integrated set of needs to the design input requirements, because the capability analysis is saying, what capability do we need to mitigate those loss scenarios?
One problem I see with the functional versus non-functional thing is that in the past, a lot of the software development approaches, they focus on the prime functionality, the purpose of the system, and the reason why they treated other things as non-functional because it wasn't part of the core function. But it seems like in today's world, the core function's got to be more than just what you tend to do with the system. It's your ability to do it right and prevent losses. And so convincing the software people that this functional approach, and not just for security, but for safety and sustainability, needs to be addressed that same way as primary function.
That's what we're getting at, is that if you deliver a system that performs all the functions that you wanted, but did not consider any loss scenarios, you're not going to be performing those functions for very long. It gets back to when I was working in the test and evaluation environment, the idea that we can't just have the happy path. We have to have the off-nominal cases. We need to make sure that we think of how the user might use the system differently than we intended and make sure it still works. I just bought a new tablet. Microsoft has gone to a new processor, and I found every incompatibility as I tried to install my WPI access software, and when I tried to connect it to a printer, and the printer drivers didn't work because everything they did was based on Windows 11, not Windows 11 on a different processor. And they picked a new processor because they want to optimize their AI, their Copilot. That's the generative AI for Microsoft, the competition to OpenAI's ChatGPT. So that was just another example of somebody who tested the happy path and didn't think about hooking up a printer, which should be plug and play. It shouldn't take me 3 days to do it. Okay, so we have a question here about how does a program's protection plan fit in here? Program protection came about to say we need to address all aspects. So the program protection plan is talking about how you're going to design the system to be secure. In the program protection plan, you're going to identify some of these strategies, but you're also going to be identifying some of the security policies, because not everything can be handled with a embedded system function or a firewall or a segregated network. Sometimes you need to have rules on how things are going to be done and security policies. So those all get wrapped up in the program protection plan. And then I see, Shana, we need to prevent unintended functions or actions more than just losses. Yes, unintended functions. We spend a lot of time defining what security means. Some threats are just people using the system differently than we meant. And Joseph says potentially a risk analysis opportunity. So that's what loss-driven analysis is, I believe, because you're saying what are the losses can you tolerate and how are we going to mitigate them? We get nervous about calling it a risk analysis because as a community, we celebrated the risk management framework coming out because we thought it would allow us to look at the assets that were in the system and to prioritize them so that you weren't trying to implement security that was not feasible. You were trying to make the system as secure as possible, and that the risk management framework allowed us to make that risk analysis. Because we're focused on the asset and not the loss-driven scenarios, and because it was a threat-based analysis, the RMF ended up being pull out the controls out of the closet anti-pattern. So we get a little nervous when people say, is this the same as risk management or is this a risk analysis like the RMF? It is, but we try to not have somebody say, oh, I know what the RMF is. I know what the risk management framework is. And that means that, we just pull all the controls out. All right, so Lou asked about the ASARA. So the idea here is that you're not trying to make it completely secure. You're trying to say as secure as reasonably achievable. So you're trying to say, what is it that makes sense? That what is the losses that we can live with because it's not feasible? We don't have enough time or money to make it so that nothing could ever happen. So that's what the ASARA is. And I don't think that's a concept that was invented by security. I think we stole that from safety. And then Frank has any advice on how he might go about convincing management to take a different approach to requiring compliance? Compliance is difficult. If somebody insists on imposing these compliance requirements that are compliance with one of the control closets, I was able to say, okay, those requirements are going to be allocated to a test case that's done by analysis. And then I would show that my design satisfied those compliance requirements. But yeah, it's a difficult battle. And the problem I find is that if you get one set of stakeholders to agree to it and they go, oh, I get it, that makes sense, it ends up being everybody has a veto power. You get one person who says, oh, no, I need to see everything on the checklist, and then you're scrambling.
So one thing related to that from a management standpoint, in some of our previous discussions, the integrated set of needs also represents the scope of the project. And so all the needs of dealing with security, when those are baselined by management, that says that management is committing to the resources in order to realize those needs. So that's an important thing about the scope is you want a secure system, management has to be willing to pay for it.
That's another motivation for having a needs assessment that is a loss-driven analysis set of, you want an integrated set of needs and you want those design input requirements that represent the functional capabilities the system has to provide to be a secure system. You need those because if you just have non-functional requirements, you don't understand what the resources are because it tends to be we'll figure it out later.
If I could throw in a comment on that, that's so important because what we end up running into is the default idea that it's 100% risk mitigation all the time. That's a fallacious way of looking at it. It's a question of how much risk tolerance an organization is willing to establish and then how much they're willing to invest in that. So I think that point about the investment is a critical thing because you're buying down risk to a certain point that's acceptable. And it's not 100%. You can't avoid everything. You can't avoid all losses. So I threw a note in there about a paper I put together on resourcefulness. That's a concept that I've been playing around with in terms of when you have the loss, how do you adapt? How do you change in the new context to redefine potentially what some of your needs are? And are some of your needs fundamentally different because you have new opportunities that emerge from a loss sometimes too. So I don't know if that is something to think about as well, the resourcefulness aspect.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you putting the link there. Comment that came in is a threat-driven approach inferior to loss-driven approach. I'm not going to say that. What I'm trying to say is that you need both of them. And the loss-driven approach needs to be first because that's what's going to give you the strategy. The threat-driven approach is going to give you the tactics. And that's why I keep going back to that quote about if you have the tactics in the absence of strategy, you're just not going to get there. And then Jan's got security-related losses require a different set of skills to mitigate versus functional losses. Yeah, that's a true statement, and that has a lot to do with why we're advocating for the collaborative effort between systems engineering and system security engineering. And then Andrew has, is this approach rightly viewed as the context of waterfall methods as opposed to agile methods? Absolutely not. In fact, the sustainable security concepts I took from an INCOSE Insight article that Larry Rosser wrote on how to design a sustainable security using agile techniques, because you're still in a loss-driven analysis to come up with your integrated set of needs. But then as you translate each of those needs into strategies, into those capabilities that we define as functional requirements, those become your features. And then you can further define the tactics, and the techniques become the user stories. We're using the waterfall concept, or the flattened waterfall. It's not a waterfall. It's, what would we call this, Lou? It's not a systems V. It's a flattened V. It's like a lap pool. It's all contained.
In other diagrams in the needs and requirements manual, I talk about the engineering V, and I've attached to that V a mapping of an architecture that's 5 levels. And the intent of what you're showing in this diagram applies to each part of the architecture. So we're not doing this necessarily only at the system level. We're defining needs and requirements for subsystems, system elements, just at a lower level of abstraction and more focused for those. That's what we talk about baseline system element, and the system's made up of a whole bunch of system elements. So that's how we cover that. Try to avoid the use of the word waterfall because it has a negative connotation about a one-way flow.
Right.
What we're talking about is iterative and recursive as you move down. When it comes to agile, Katrina Kott, she teaches agile. That's her life, and she's one of the co-chairs. And her and I have been working together to do a mapping, just like you did, of agile to the needs and requirements manual. And she's using a certain agile framework that's fairly popular. It has similar kind of things, just different terminology. And so we can use the approach that you took to map the two together. And we're saying that agile could benefit from some of the stuff system engineering does and what's in the needs requirements manual. But also systems engineers can benefit also from some of the agile approaches, especially when it comes to the transformation between the design inputs and the design outputs.
Right. You know, I know when I was working with agile techniques and when we were trying to develop the system requirements, design input requirements, and my agile software teams would be, when are you going to give me my user stories on the feature backlog? So I did some papers for NDIA on how we were torturing the systems engineers, the way we were trying to implement agile. And I proposed that we think of what the system engineer generates in the integrated set of needs that's at a higher level, but the design input requirements end up being the features, but we still have features. I didn't have your way of talking about it. The design output specifications are also features that relate to the design input requirements. And I started calling them sub features, and the safe people got mad. So I basically said the system engineers are using Kanban and they define the features. And then once they define the features in the design output specification format, now we can move to the Scrum timeframe that was being used by those teams. So yeah, we had to have a modified approach for the features versus the stories. So how do we arrive at a belief that an SOI is acceptable? Well, if you've defined your loss-driven scenarios, you've defined what your acceptable loss is. So that's getting at that concept that we stole from safety about the as secure as reasonably achievable.
All right, a couple more comments. Thanking the community and good presentation. So we certainly do thank you for your time, Dr. Wilson. Excellent presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present this. A lot of work went into this product, and we're very proud of it.
As should be. Thank you for y'all's time.
Yeah, thank you everyone attending. Thank you,
Thanks,
Beth, for all the
Barry.
work you've been doing on this.